In this episode of the Caustic Rebel Podcast,
there was a bit of a bromance there. Jordan is from Alberta, and Dennis is from Saskatchewan. Strangely, you're from Alberta, I'm from Saskatchewan. So we're kind of like a little mini-me version of that podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
Yo, report.
Got it.
Good evening. Welcome to the Caustic Rebel Podcast. I'm Peter O'Shea, and this is my co-host, Tom Quinn. Today, we're going to be having reactions to a recent Jordan Peterson podcast, where he interviewed fusion energy expert, Dr. Dennis Whyte. Tom, my friend of many years, is relatively frequent listener of Jordan Peterson. I myself was new to his podcast and his style, and Tom knows that I'm a fusion researcher myself. I received my PhD in fusion research from MIT about the same time. Tom, you were at MIT at the same time, and what's your field? Bioelectromechanics?
Yeah, bioelectromechanics. No, I was in mechanical engineering and medical engineering. I studied the biomechanics of cartilage tissue. And we overlapped there. So we were in completely different institutions, just so our listener is aware of that. But we were contemporaries at MIT. What's most relevant to the review that we'll be doing today, of course, is your background, PJ, in plasma. And just by way of being explicit about the Jordan Peterson podcast, if people want to look that one up, it was episode 424, and it came out on the 19th of February 2024.
Okay.
And it's
good
actually
at this. I think we can put links to it in whatever format
okay,
we're gonna. Right?
Yeah. Anyways, he has a podcast where he interviews people from all walks of life. Like he might interview people who are politicians or other clinical psychologists, or in this case, a plasma physicist. I mean, it's very wide ranging podcast, and I think it's fair to say that his main objective is to have meaningful discussions with people, to promote exchange of ideas and meaningful discussion in a world where that's actually not as common as one would hope. But anyways, PJ, perhaps you could introduce Dennis Whyte's background, and then when you're finished with that, please describe your own background.
Okay. My background is surprisingly similar to Dennis Whyte. We are both from Saskatchewan. We both studied engineering physics at the University of Saskatchewan. I believe Dennis was just 2 years ahead of me. University of Saskatchewan is a small but long-standing, excellent faculty in plasma physics, both in fusion and in atmospheric sciences. Dennis got the bug from one of the professors and sought graduate studies in fusion. I believe he studied in the last vestiges of Canada's fusion program. We had a large tokamak in Quebec, Tokamak de Varennes, and he did his thesis work there in magnetized fusion energy. I went to MIT and was one of the first graduate students on the Alcator CMOD tokamak that was built and started operating in the early 90s. and fusion is seeing a resurgence lately, but it definitely had a bit of a, dark ages in there, and pretty much all but one of my cohort in the grad school has found another way of making a living, as you were essentially forced to, because fusion was not a going concern at the time. Dennis stayed in the peripheries in the academic work. I really don't know. His expertise is quite technological. I know I might be getting him confused with another Dr. Whyte at MIT, who I know is a edge plasma specialist. Anyhow, Dennis did very well, and at a time when the fusion center there at MIT was in grave jeopardy of being shut down, they were losing federal funding. Dennis was made director of the Fusion Center, and explicitly charged with finding a bridge to a continuation of the excellent research that they were doing. And my background, I mean, like I said, it's kind of the diaspora of plasma physicists. We scattered to the four corners. I, like some meaningful minority, went into semiconductor manufacturing because some of the processes involve plasma. That's kind of the connection. I've been doing that for a number of years, 25 years or so. There was an interesting return to fusion. He had a startup here in Vancouver, but I find myself now back in the semiconductor industry. And interestingly, Tom, this is maybe I can't help but and fusion is kind of a going concern now. You hear about it in the headlines and things. So I'm constantly asked by my peers and, mostly in the semiconductor industry, they're like, hey, didn't you do fusion and what's going on? And it's fairly interesting to follow, and I have been following it, but from the outside. And it's just really this, for a further podcast, we can talk about the nature of research. Briefly, I feel very strongly that I have a much better understanding of what's going on in fusion now that I'm on the outside of it than when I was in every day. As many very technical people tend to do, you focus, and you're way down your silo, and you're not seeing the high level stuff. You're not seeing the industry. You're not seeing so from the outside, I'm far more aware, of what's being said, and as we will talk about, what's not being said in the industry, and so perhaps you could say, "Oh, I'm a ex fusion researcher, so what does it matter what I have to say?" My strong personal belief is that I'm in a far better position to speak about the fusion industry, as it were, now than I was 5 years ago when I was in it up to my ears. So fusion is in the news, and I think that congratulate Jordan Peterson for wanting to talk to somebody. There was a bit of a bromance there. Jordan is from Alberta, and Dennis is from Saskatchewan. Strangely, you're from Alberta, I'm from Saskatchewan, so we're kind of like a little mini-me version of that podcast.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, let's see. Can I?
Do you want to
go ahead? What?
Do you want to jump in? Like, what do you?
Yeah, I want to jump in. I want to know, like, just in 5 minutes. We won't go into details.
Okay.
But I just want to, like, we won't go yet into details. But like, in general, the podcast, as I perceived it, it was an hour and a half, and there was an hour, basically. I mean, almost exactly an hour of discussion about the physics of plasma fusion. explained obviously to a scientifically minded but not specialist audience. And then there was a half an hour of rather pointed questions about the status of fusion as a viable technology for providing energy commercially, right? And the questions, I know that your opinion is that the questions weren't quite pointed enough, but and that's fair enough. We'll get into that. But I'm just curious to know, like, overall, how would you characterize the quality of the discussion, either from Peterson or from Dennis Whyte? How what did you think about the podcast, just in broad strokes?
Oh, broad strokes. I liked it. And I mean, Dennis is engaging. He can describe in physical, physically, I don't know, inspiring ways some of the important things that are happening in these fusion devices. I mean, that's good. It's great outreach. It's interesting. You're like, wow, Ed. But for an hour, maybe a little bit too much. And like you said, at the 60-minute mark of a 90-minute podcast, it did turn and it said, now, okay. He asked the question. He said, fusion has been 10 years away for the last 50 years. So what gives?
Yeah, Jordan Peterson asked that.
Yeah, which is the question.
Yeah.
Really. And I mean, Dennis, in answering, and here we're gonna get into it, I guess, a little bit. I mean, what Dennis said, by and large, was true. But I am going to make an important distinction between true and meaningfully true, or maybe I'll bring up this slide. You're going to hate this. I don't think you like slides.
No, I like slides. I just don't want to look at them for longer than is necessary to make the point.
For you to tell them what
there he is.
Energy is and how that differs from standard nuclear energy, just like a rationale for the pursuit of fusion energy and a place and placing of it in the proper context with regard to our pursuit of advanced energy and reliable energy supplies.
Right. Sorry to cut you off there, Dennis, but that was a big ask by Jordan. Place fusion in the proper context. And I also have to point out that in my brief, review of who Jordan is, he's big on the truth. He makes an important
Rule 8 is tell the truth or at least don't lie. And originally that
this is from his recent 12 Rules for Life. I think you might have been referring to that there, Tom. And,
yeah, I mentioned it
briefly, because we are going to run out of time. There's true things, and then there's meaningfully true things, and then similarly, maybe when we're asked to tell the truth, I think there's an implication that we should tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So that, like in Perry Mason. And so by that metric, I have to say, okay, did Dennis tell the truth? Yes. The first 60 minutes is just loaded with truths. Regarding the whole truth, I really think he missed the boat. I really feel that overall, it was 90 minutes. Overall, I feel he failed to do what his host asked, which is to put fusion in a proper context of reliable, sustainable energy. And he didn't say things that were untrue, but I feel that there's misleading element by saying things that are true, but not meaningfully so. For example, a really important point that Dennis implies, one of the enabling, present day enabling elements that why fusion, why today, is computational power. And I think this is what he says on the topic.
Ability, which I presume enables you to model the things that you would otherwise have to build and test much more precisely, much more rapidly. And so you can see an acceleration of movement towards the end goal.
Sorry, it was cut off there. And Dennis makes this point, a correct point, that there's been tremendous advancements in computational power. 100% true. But I think it's misleading because he also touches on the magnitude of the complexity of fusion plasmas. And I believe the meaningful truth is that whereas we've seen exponential increase in computational power, it's still dwarfed by the sheer complexity of the plasma system that you have to model, so much so that the field is still very empirical. And I guess that's one of the big failings. I feel we could touch on other ones. I mean, just
just let me as a view, as a layperson, say, like a
Sure.
scientifically minded, say, layperson. I was, because I know you in the back of my mind when I was listening to the podcast. I know you, and for our listener, the PJ has written a couple of dozen articles that are on LinkedIn, and they're educational and funny, and I highly recommend them. And they're about the physics of plasmas, and also it goes into explaining strategies for achieving commercial grade plasmas, and sort of critiques of various approaches that are being pursued in the present days, and critiques in general about the way people operate in the plasma field. Anyways, so I'm having read those articles, I'm a bit familiar with PJ's perspective. And one thing that is emphasized is this notion of computing power. The impression that was left by the podcast was that we're much closer to achieving computer simulation of plasmas than I think is actually the case.
Here's a quote from the sister field to Dennis's field. Dennis works in magnetized fusion, but also the laser fusion, or inertially confined fusion, has made a lot of news lately. And those like Dennis, who are academic leaders in the field, have not made a meaningful distinction between the two. So I feel okay referencing a quote I found in a 2020 paper here out of the Atomic Weapons Establishment in the UK, talking about laser fusion. The paper was about their massive supercomputers and how awesome it was, and terabytes, this, that, and the other thing, exponentially more powerful than dozens of years ago. However, he makes this little caveat. Although remarkable, this level of computing does not provide a fully predictive capability. In fact, such a capability will not be possible in the coming 2 decades, even if Moore's law, the exponential rise of computing power, continues to hold for that entire time. And so he says, therefore, we will rely on empirical data. And that's just singing my tune. And by the way, it's not just me that, I don't know if you can see this, that are a little concerned, or more than a little concerned about the obfuscation of the important issues in the field. This is Sabine Hossenfelder, a very popular, she's a physicist herself, and has a good following on YouTube, where she can translate some complex physics for people and talk about issues. And here she is. This whole video, she says she can't help feel, but scientists in the fusion area are confusing the public and policymakers, and that she says this. Here we are. Let's let her talk.
This misinformation has to stop. If you come across any popular science article or interview or video that does not clearly spell out what the total energy gain is, please call them out on it. Thanks for watching. See you next week.
How pleasant. Yeah, and just before we get cut off, I am a fusion advocate, and I think fusion can be made to work, but it's incredibly complex. And to be fair, the industry was in a bit of an existential crisis maybe 8 years ago, and they are no longer so. However, I question how much they have short-sold their scientific credibility by, in Hossenfelder's words, willfully misleading the policymakers and public. Here is a credentialed physicist in the field with her thoughts on the matter.
And many scientists worry that these startups are promising too much.
The cons, in my mind, are the promises by companies who either have a concept that we have already, for good reason, put apart and knew why they won't work, or completely new concepts. Some change them every other year, and then they still promise fusion energy by 2030 or something. And I don't like that too much, because I'm afraid that if there are so many promises not kept, that this would not be positive for fusion energy in general.
That is the premise, and I think we can go through some of the details in the podcast that help support this point that I'm making. I think Dennis doesn't properly put fusion in the context of sustainable energy, and Jordan was very close a few times, and he asked some excellent questions. Dennis was conspicuously silent on at least two very important points.
Tune in next time, dear listener, as your dynamic duo tackle other daunting questions with other guests. Stay tuned for our upcoming 3-part series with Conor McGregor.
Well, a wrecking ball is swinging, ringside bells are ringing. The fat lady, she's singing, but I ain't done, no, I ain't done, and the traffic lights turn red. There's a price on my head.